All right, so today we're going to be taking a look at all of the classic Castlevania games, which are usually referred to as Classicvania under the unofficial fan designation. Now, essentially, in a nutshell, if you don't know, these games are the more traditional Castlevania experiences that predate the Metroidvania style of gameplay started with Symphony of the Night. And I love the Metroidvania games with all my heart. I think they're fantastic. I think it's one of the most consistent game franchises in terms of quality. But the thing is, you know, these traditional games are worth trying if you haven't. I think they're all great games, or at least like worth experiencing. Perhaps there isn't like a truly bad one, apart from like maybe one or two, which we'll get into in a moment. But yeah, so with a lot of tier lists, you typically have your S to F ranking, and I think that's fine. But the problem is it's a little bit too limited for these games, I think. So what I've actually got here is, if we look at this graph vertically, then the higher up the game is, the easier it is. The lower it is, the hardest. And left to right is essentially how fair or unfair it is. Because, like, I think a lot of people combine difficulty and for how forgiving a game is, they kind of put it in the same category, and that doesn't really accurately fit a lot of these retro games, because a lot of these retro games can be either like way too difficult or way too easy, but they're just unfair, right? So, but yeah, and what better place to start with the original Castlevania? Now, I just want to preface by saying this is a great game. I think it's worth playing, for sure, if you haven't already. It is very, very simple in terms of, like, the gameplay, but from some people's perspective, it's also very pure in that sense. Like, I can appreciate this game because of its simplicity, where you only have 6 stages, and that's it. You just go from the beginning to the end. There's not like branching pathways or anything like that. It's a very controlled experience. Now, the question is, how would I rank this in terms of fairness and difficulty? I'd say it is pretty challenging. If we're looking at these games, even if we're comparing them from others at the time, this is a pretty challenging game for sure. I would even say one of the harder games on the NES. Now, is it unfair? Well, one of the really infamous things about Classicvania is the knockback, and this game has it in spades. There are plenty of levels where if you get like knocked by a Medusa head or something, you're essentially dead, and that's it. And this happens as early as the second level. So I don't know. Is it I'll definitely put it down here in terms of how hard it is. Definitely a hard game. Is it unfair? I think because of the knockback, it definitely has a bit of that. But I wouldn't say it's like super unfair. I think I'll probably put it around like here-ish, I think, for now. And we'll just go from there. Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. So this is another oh, man. Okay, so this is one of those cases where, for the sequel, they wanted to do something totally different. This game plays completely different to the first game, with virtually no relation other than you're playing as Simon Belmont and you've got your vampire killer weapon and all that. But essentially, this is more of like an RPG and almost feels like a prototype of what the Metroidvania genre would become. It's not a great game. I'm going to be completely honest. It's not great. I think there is an argument to be made here as to whether or not you're playing the Japanese or American version. The Japanese version is definitely better in that if you can read Japanese, the hints that the townspeople give you are significantly more in depth and more direct. In the American version, they're essentially useless. Like, the most infamous example is, of course, the red crystal thing. I don't know how anyone is supposed to figure that out on their first playthrough. So, that all being said, is it an easy game? I would say in terms of like difficulty of the combat, absolutely. You can straight up skip a bunch of the bosses. It's almost like the easiest game in the series, arguably, in terms of just like the raw challenge of just completing the levels. It's not difficult at all. It's not a hard game. But it's also really unfair in that, again, because of the aforementioned issues with the hints, you almost need a guide to complete this game, or at the very least, you're going to have an easier time if you have a guide, I think. Now, is it? I don't really want to put it over here because of some of the games coming up, which we'll get into. I don't want to put it over here. I think for now that this is an okay spot. I think it is a very easy game, so we're gonna put it towards the top here. I think there is probably fine. Haunted Castle. So, in terms of order of release, this is a bit of an odd one. It was an arcade game, which is sort of like a semi-sequel / remake of the first game. You're playing as Simon Belmont, and you're going through Dracula's castle and all that. And it is very linear in that it plays much closer to that original game. But it is one of the least forgiving arcade games you could possibly play. You know how most arcade games, even from that era, if you kept feeding the machine quarters, you could essentially continue for forever. Not with this game. If you run out of lives, even if you have more quarters, which, by the way, I say lives, there's only one life. So if you die, that's it, and I don't believe there's any way to get more. You're starting from the beginning. Like, that's it. You're starting from the beginning of the game, even if you have like more quarters in the machine. And it is really, really difficult. Like, I mean really difficult. Now, I do want to highlight the reason why I mentioned here that we're talking about the Japanese version is because how you experience this game varies greatly depending on whether you're playing the Japanese or US version. The US version, for some reason, it has this design choice where the later levels, the enemies do more damage. And I don't think that happens on the European or Japanese release. So that definitely eases the challenge a little bit. Now, is it unfair? I would say it's definitely unfair. I think if we need some sort of like extreme for this graph, this would be like down here, I think. Or around here. It's very, very difficult. The enemies do a ton of damage. And the levels are designed to eat your quarters. So I would say around here, maybe here. I don't know. We'll put it there for now. We'll come back to it later if we need to change it. Castlevania The Adventure on Game Boy. So when this game came out, it was actually a pretty big deal because it was the first time we had a portable Castlevania experience. And so it was very highly praised by critics. But looking back, it's not a good game. And I don't mean that because it's on Game Boy. The Game Boy had the capability to create great action-adventure games, like your Zeldas and all that. But this game is just not good. Christopher Belmont moves really, really slow, and he's just not fun to control. There's no sub-weapons. Your whip, whenever you take a hit, it gets downgraded. I think there's only 4 levels in the game, and so what they did is they made them feel like complete slogs, so it felt like a longer game than it actually was. But from like a difficulty perspective, is it hard? I think it is hard in the sense that you're kind of fighting with the controls. Christopher moves very slowly, as I said, and his jump is very limited. You can't jump that far, and it's one of those things where if you're making these platforms, it's very not. It doesn't feel like consistent or reliable at all because you need like very large pixel precision. So that being said, is it a hard game? I'd say, honestly, compared to other games in the series, it's pretty average. You could definitely play some harder Castlevanias. I don't know. I think I'll put it around, like, here for now in terms of unfairness. It's just not a great game, but it's not, like, one of the worst games ever. You know what I mean? You could do much worse. There just isn't really any reason to play it now, I think. Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. Now, I'm very fond of this game, and I think many people are. In a lot of ways, it is what Castlevania 2 on NES should have been. It feels like a direct sequel to the first game. You're playing as Trevor Belmont, and I think the game takes place a couple hundred years before the events of the first game. This game is great. I think it's honestly one of the best games on NES. Now, that being said, it is very, very challenging. But I think the way I would rank this game's difficulty, again, depends on whether or not we're talking about the Japanese version. The Japanese version is absolutely more forgiving and easier. For one, I can't remember which character it is, but basically this game has recruitable characters, right? And I can't remember his name, but one of them always has a throwable dagger, which makes the game significantly easier if you choose to play as him. Just having that dagger is like a massive benefit. And in general, the game is just more balanced. The enemies don't do more damage later in the game like they do in the North American release. And if you lose the Dracula fight, as long as you have lives remaining, the game puts you right in front of the boss room. You don't have to do the level over again like you have to in the American release. And that's a huge benefit if you're playing on original hardware. On emulation, I guess that's less relevant because of save states and all that. But it's worth mentioning for sure. So if we're going off of the Japanese version, which is definitely the way to play this game if you have the option, is it unfair? It has knockback. But I will say a lot of the level design does tone down the bottomless pits a bit. There's still a lot of them, don't get me wrong. But it's not that bad overall. I mean, it's a hard game for sure. As far as difficulty goes, I would actually say it is harder than the first game. Let's move these over just a little bit here, I think. I will say it is probably harder than the first game. But it is probably a little bit more fair between the two. So this is a case where it's just an insanely hard game, but I wouldn't call it that unfair, at least for its time. It's absolutely worth playing if you're good at Castlevania games, but I wouldn't recommend it to any beginner for any reason. It's really not. It's a hard game. I would say play something easier first, like one of the games we're going to get into shortly, instead of this. But it is a fantastic game if you're in the mood for a challenge. Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge, not to be confused with Simon's Quest on NES, which is also titled Castlevania 2. This is a sequel to Castlevania The Adventure on Game Boy. And for all intents and purposes, this is a massive, massive improvement on that original game. Castlevania The Adventure sucks. This game is actually quite good, and I think it's worth experiencing. It is all pretty short, but it has a lot of basic improvements. Christopher moves. He's still kind of slow, but he's much faster. The controls feel much more responsive. The level design is better. The game runs better, whereas the original, The Adventure on Game Boy, is just like constant slowdown. This one is worth playing, I think. And as far as difficulty goes, I'd probably put it pretty close to smack dab in the middle. Maybe like around here-ish. It's a hard game, but it's not really unfair in any capacity. I'd say it's like super average in terms of challenge. Like around here, probably, is about where I would put it. Yeah, I think that's a good spot to put it for now. It's a very like middle of the road kind of experience in that way. It's a good game though. I think it is worth trying if you get the chance. Super Castlevania 4 on Super Nintendo. So, this is a game that I think a lot of people hold very dear to them. And it's easy to understand why. This, in a lot of ways, is a pretty big improvement on NES games. Nowadays, I think everyone looks at it differently depending on what kind of experience they're looking for in their Castlevania game. This game made one major change that has been divisive in recent years, and that's the ability to whip in multiple directions. In all of these previous games, you can only whip horizontally left to right, and that's it. But in this one, you can whip up and down, you can whip diagonally, you can dangle the vampire killer around, and like it's really good for stuff like bats and Medusa heads for that reason. The sense of control in this game is fantastic. Simon feels like really smooth. Platforming is a non-issue. It feels really good. And because of that, because of the level of control they give you, I would say this is arguably the easiest game in the Classicvania sub-series in terms of how they play. This game is not that challenging for a Castlevania game. And because of that reason, I would say it's fantastic for a beginner. Now, is it unfair or fair? It definitely has its moments, like in one of the later levels, you're on this moving platform, and you have to continue to keep moving left, or else the platform, because it's moving upward, you're going to hit one of the spikes on the ceiling. That's a bit of a beginner's trap for sure, so that makes it a little bit unfair. But overall, this is a very fair game. I'd almost want to put it like around here-ish on the scale. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good spot for now. It's a very fair Castlevania game, and it's also a very easy one for its time. So if you want to start, this is a great starting place for sure. Castlevania Rondo of Blood on PC Engine CD. Man, what a fantastic game. I absolutely adore Rondo of Blood. It's probably my favorite Classicvania game. The sub-weapons that you can have feel really good. They feel powerful. Because you're limited to the horizontal whipping again, they feel like they have more of a purpose, and you want to actually think about which one you're going to use before a boss encounter. You can unlock Maria Renard, which is a great character for beginners because of her double jump ability, her slide, her really good item crashes she gets with her sub-weapons. That's another great part of this game is the item crash ability, where basically you spend a bunch of ammunition to do a big special move. It's really, really cool, and it's really great for those bosses. This is a fantastic Castlevania game, like straight up. Is it fair? I would say it's honestly one of the most fair games in the entire franchise. There are so much of the bullshit from the earlier NES titles is just gone. There aren't that many bottomless pits, and in cases where there are pits, many of the levels have alternate pathways you can take, so oftentimes if you fall into a pit, you'll just fall to the bottom pathway and can continue onward, which is such a cathartic feeling after dealing with the nonsense in these games. It's fantastic in terms of like the sense of like they really respect the player's time. It is a very fair game. Now, is it easy? I would say some of these levels are really tough, actually. I almost want to put it down with the original, maybe like a little bit above. Yeah, I'd say it's around the original in terms of difficulty, maybe a little bit harder in some spots. There's one part, I think stage 6 is basically like a boss rush. Some of those bosses are pretty tough, but again, hearkening back to the idea of being fair, if you defeat the first few bosses, then the game actually has a checkpoint if you die, and the last boss of the boss rush, you don't have to start from the beginning. You just continue right back where you left off, which is like such a great quality of life feature and really keeps the pace going, I think. So while this game is challenging, arguably as challenging as Dracula's Curse, or maybe a little bit easier, like I'd say around here, so it'll be like a little bit harder than the original. In some ways, it is super fair. It is a really fair game. And also a great starting point, I think. If you want something more challenging compared to Super Castlevania 4, but you want something really fair, This is one of the best games in the series, straight up. It is fantastic, and I think everyone should play it if you haven't already. Castlevania Bloodlines on Sega Genesis. So this game kind of has a tragic story to it in that it was a commercial failure and essentially cemented that Konami would not release any more Castlevania games on Sega hardware, at least for a little while, until the Japan-only port of Symphony of the Night to the Saturn. And that's a shame, because this game is pretty good, actually. Now, how hard is it? I would say somewhere in between Belmont's Revenge and the original. It's a pretty tough game. Is it unfair? I don't think so. I think it is a pretty fair game. I think it's certainly more fair than the NES games. If I had to knock it a few points, which would otherwise keep it from being like around here, that last level, stage 6, they have like this anti-gravity thing going on, which I can appreciate from a level gimmick perspective, but considering no other part of the game has it, it kind of takes you by surprise. And I think if you're not ready for that, it's a bit of a beginner's trap in that sense. But overall, it's pretty fair. I would say I'd put it like around here-ish, probably. Yeah, I think that's a good spot. It's a tough game. Probably about as hard as the NES games, maybe a bit easier, like maybe up to here or something. I think Belmont's Revenge is certainly easier. Yeah, it's a good game. It's good. It's well balanced. It's one of the best games on the Genesis, in my opinion, and it's pretty short. You can beat it in like about an hour or so if you know what you're doing, I think. So originally, Rondo of Blood was a Japanese exclusive until many years later, where it got a release on PSP and then later on the PlayStation 4. So for a while, what we got was Dracula X on Super Nintendo, which is like a semi-remake of the PC Engine game. I'm going to be completely honest. The PC Engine original blows this game to smithereens. This is not a good Castlevania game, in my opinion. It's not super hard. Like, I think overall, difficulty-wise, it's like somewhere between average and like just below. But it is horribly, horribly unfair. I would almost say it's the most unfair Classicvania game. There are so many bottomless pits and like awful enemy placement where it's really awkward. You find yourself not having the sub-weapon you need to actually defeat the enemy. Like, it'll put those Spear Knight guys like right above the stairs. It almost feels like they designed the game with Castlevania 4's Simon Belmont mobility in mind and then switched it to Richter at the last minute. And unlike the PC Engine original, you can't play as Maria. You can rescue her, but you can't play as her. So you're limited to Richter. And the game itself doesn't have alternate pathways or like secret levels like Rondo of Blood. It's just straight to the end. So I think some people might prefer that, since it's more direct. But there's just not a lot to this game. There's less levels. The music is good. It's mostly intact. It's remixes of the CD audio from Rondo of Blood, and it's good music. It's not bad, actually. I really like it. It's some of the best on the Super Nintendo, but it's just horribly unfair. I think it's worth trying if you're curious, but like, just play it on emulator. It's a pretty expensive game. It's like within the range of like $200. It's not worth it at all. Don't buy it unless you're trying to complete the collection. Yeah, I would say this is the least fair game on the list, but it's not that challenging. Castlevania Legends, the final Game Boy game. So this is a hard one for me to comment on because I believe it was made non-canon. So it is interesting in that you're playing as a female Belmont, Sonia. And I believe it was originally going to be the first game in the Castlevania timeline. But because of the way circumstances changed, and I don't want to spoil the story, but essentially some weird things happen which would have made it so that the Belmonts were kind of descendants of Dracula, or at least that's what was being implied. So they ultimately made it non-canon. It's I think it's definitely better than Castlevania the Adventure, but it's not a great game for the Game Boy. It has your typical unfairness sort of thing going on there. It's not a great game. It is fairly easy, actually. Like, I don't think it's super challenging. I'd probably put it like around here-ish. But how unfair it is, I don't know. Maybe like around here. It's a little bit unfair. It's not unbearable. It's just not very fun to play. There are some interesting things going on. Like, you can do some magic, which is cool. And there's like cutscenes with dialogue between characters, which is neat for the Game Boy, for sure. I think it's a little bit longer than Belmont's Revenge, which some people might appreciate. I don't know, especially considering this game came out like after Symphony of the Night on the PlayStation. It was pretty disappointing for the time, I think. But I don't think it's like a bad game per se. It's just not good either, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think I'll put it there for now. I think that's a pretty fair ranking. Castlevania Chronicles on PlayStation. So this is actually an enhanced port of a Sharp X68000 game that was only released in Japan. It's essentially a remaster / remake of the original Castlevania on NES. It's actually much closer to the source material in that the levels are very similar. They're essentially the same with minor tweaks, unlike Super Castlevania 4, which has totally different levels. This game is actually very good, I think, but it depends on what version you're playing. So there's two different versions. I think there's original mode, and then there's remix mode, if I'm not mistaken. And they're both included on every release, Japanese, European, whatever. It's all there. The original mode plays much closer to the original on NES, as you would expect. But it for some reason it seems like they really upped the difficulty. It's honestly a harder game, I would say, than the original on NES. But if you're playing the remix mode, the game does a complete 180 and becomes one of the most fair games in the series. I believe knockback is removed, so you don't get knocked back into pits. It is challenging, but not like super challenging. I would say it's easier than the NES original on remix mode for the knockback reason alone. It's a good game, man. It's good. If you're playing remix mode, I think original mode kind of sucks, to be honest, and I would put it like around here. But if you're playing on remix mode, yeah, this is a good spot for it. It's pretty fair. It's not super hard. I'd say around here, more or less, is probably the place I'd put it. It's a good game. It's worth trying, I think. It got massively overshadowed by Symphony of the Night on PlayStation. But it's worth trying at least once, I think, if you want a slightly different original Castlevania experience. Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. So I was debating as to whether or not I was going to include remakes on this graph. But the thing is, this one is so different to the original on Game Boy that I think it was worth putting here. So this was a WiiWare exclusive released in 2009 as part of the Konami Rebirth short-lived miniseries. And it is, for all intents, a really good remake, I think. It trims a lot of the fat. There are quirks they have with it, like they didn't remix the original songs of the Game Boy game. Instead, they like pulled music from other games, which was kind of weird and it felt out of place. It's a fairly easy game. I would say it's one of the easier Classicvanias. Is it fair or unfair? I would say it's definitely more. It's certainly more fair than the original. Compared to other games on this list, I think I'd put it around like here-ish, probably, maybe around where Castlevania Chronicles is. I think this is a good spot for it. It doesn't have a lot of the nonsense of the earlier games. I believe knockback is either off or you can turn it off, so that's good for new players especially. This is a good game. Yeah, I think it's worth trying if you can get a copy of it, which is impossible to do legally now with the Wii store shut down. But of course, there's like emulation. So if you don't mind going that route, you can get your hands on this game, and it's worth trying. It's worth trying for sure, I think. Haunted Castle Revisited. So this is another remake, and it's technically the most recent Classicvania game. So this is part of the Castlevania Dominus collection on consoles and PC, which is basically the DS games. And it's just like a bonus game you can get and you can play. And it's a remake of Haunted Castle on the arcade. And I have to say, this is one of M2's best side projects. This takes what is otherwise one of, in my opinion, one of the worst Classicvania games and one of the best. It is also one of the easiest. It is not a very difficult game because it's got so many quality of life improvements. It's probably, I'd say, maybe a little bit harder than Super Castlevania 4 because they're still limited to like horizontal whipping, but it's very fair. It's almost as fair as Rondo of Blood, I would say. In fact, I'd probably put it like on par with Rondo of Blood in fairness, maybe even a little bit more fair. This is a fantastic game for newbies for sure. And it is technically the most recent Classicvania game. If you consider it like a fully fledged title, it came out just a few months ago in 2024. But anyway, here is my graph. We can take a look at it. Of course, you're welcome to agree or disagree. I know we all have different opinions on this. For me, if you just wanted like a baseline of where to start if you're new to the Castlevania games, Rondo of Blood is my personal favorite on this list. It's fantastic. It's hard, but it's not too hard, and it's super fair. Haunted Castle Revisited is also a great game to start with because it has a little bit of that challenge, but it's much more forgiving. It's got modern quality of life improvements. And Super Castlevania 4. I would say these three right here are the best to start with. Everything else, you can make it work. As far as ones to completely avoid, I'd say don't even bother with Simon's Quest. It's not a great game. If it's a curiosity for you, then fair enough. But I think for everyone else, it's not a good place to start. And Castlevania The Adventure, the original game on Game Boy, it just sucks. If you want to play a good Game Boy Castlevania game, play Belmont's Revenge. And also, yeah, definitely avoid Dracula X with a 10-foot barge pull. If you want to, again, try it for a curiosity, that's fine. But please make sure you play Rondo of Blood first, because that's like the intended experience. But yeah, that's about going to wrap it up for this video. Hope you enjoyed. Please, let's discuss this in the comments below. I think we could have a lot of interesting conversations on this topic. And yeah, I'll catch you guys all later. Bye for now.